Okay. For some reason, when my recordings start, there's this big pause and it freezes up. So I don't know what that's about. I don't know how to fix it, but I'm just doing my best here. Hey, in chapter three, there are some things that I feel the book doesn't adequately address. So I just want to, I've only got, I think, 8 slides here that I want to go through with you and talk about some of the issues related to construction sites and safety, especially as it relates to the fire service. Okay, so I'm going to just jump right into this. I'm going to make myself go away, but I just wanted to show my face and say hi. So here we go. Oops, that's not the right one. Okay, hopefully I did that right. I tried to switch it to all screen. Um, so it's, this is the same. You can look through the slides that I provided for you with the lesson plan, but other than this slide, the rest of this is going to be different than what you already saw. So also, I want you to know there's going to be at least 2 quiz questions that are going to come from this material. Okay, so make sure that you spend the time to watch this short video. Um, as firefighters, we need to know that there are a lot of inherent dangers at construction sites. One of the, actually, I believe the only agency that is involved in a building's history from cradle all the way to the grave is the fire department. We play a part in the permit process. We play a part in inspecting the plans. We are constant visitors at the job site to inspect that work is being done correctly. When the building is finished and approved, we're part of that approval process. We're one of the agencies that has to sign off. But then once they get a certificate of occupancy, they wave goodbye to the building official. But what does the fire department do? We visit them once a year to make sure that they're maintaining fire safety. We are even involved if they decide to demolish that building. We're not the main permitting agency, but we will be involved. And sometimes if the building has like standpipes, we will require them to keep a portion of the standpipes in place throughout the process, keep fire lane access clear, make sure that the fire hydrants are still working. So we're involved from cradle to grave. Now, there are a lot of regulations, and in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the International Building Code and the International Fire Code, and of course, the NFPA standards. But for here in California, we use the International Code, and it gives guidelines on all of this, including how you get a permit. So, any architect, contractor, builder owner, when they decide that they want to build something, they go through a process of assessing the site, coming up with how they're going to build it. The architect draws up the plans, engineers work on it. But before they can go any steps further than that, they have to go to the building official and turn in their blueprints. So they turn in their blueprints to the building official, and the building official will stamp them as of that day that they've been turned in, and they start to review them. Well, they'll also give, and they have to turn in a not just one, but a stack of sets, because another set is going to have to be taken to the fire department, to the zoning department, and any other agencies that they feel need to be involved. So there are great details and time involved when you go from turning in your plans to getting permission to start building. So the building department's going to do their part. The fire department, we're most involved in everything related to fire protection systems and egress and access. So, in fact, there are 2 chapters in the building code and in the fire code that are exactly the same. Chapters 9 which is all about fire protection systems, Chapter 10, which is all about exiting and egress from a building and making sure that it's safe for the people that are inside and that they can get out. So, as I said, in the planning process and the permitting and inspecting process, we're mostly involved with fire protection systems. But there are some permits that are specific to the fire department that we're going to be involved in. If they're going to do hot work, most fire departments require that they get a permit. Hot work is brazing, copper, welding that might be involved. So this is the number one cause of fires on a construction site. Let me say that again, and I might say it again in a couple of minutes. This is the number one cause of fires on a construction site. So as they go through this process to get building, we're going to require a permit for the hot work because of the hazards involved. Hey, you know what? I think I want to go back to that other slide. Nope, I'm happy with where I am. Okay, so we're also going to make them get permits if they're storing hazardous materials. We're also going to make them get permits if they have to do any confined space. If you look at this top picture in the middle, where they are backfilling the around, that's the fire line in this particular one. But notice the shoring on the sides. There's a man in there, and it's over his head deep. So if those walls collapsed, he would die. It's almost for sure. So they're required, if it's over 5 feet, to do shoring. But we're also involved in, we want to make sure that one of the first things they do when they're grading is create fire lane access. In fact, we will require that they cannot put up a single stick, something that's flammable, until fire lane access is all weather. It has to be it can be an A base, or it can actually be pouring. They don't want to pour the concrete yet for that, but if they choose to, they can do that. But usually it's going to be an A base, an all weather access. We need to be able to get in there even if it's raining, and we need that fire lane to be clear. Also, we're going to require them to have the water line in before they can put sticks up. If there's going to be hydrants on that property, then they're going to have to make sure that that's done before they start framing. So all of that is related to the permit process and making sure that construction sites are a safe place. Well, they have, we just have to have that means of suppression. Now, one of the things I didn't say about the hot work, I did say that they have a lot of fires related to the hot work. If they get a permit, they're going to be required to have an extinguisher or a hose line or some way of putting out fire if they accidentally start some materials on fire. If they catch a fire quickly on a construction site, it's usually not a big deal. So I wanted to say that before we move on to cranes. Another one of the great hazards beyond trenching and the hot work is cranes. Any kind of a building where they're going to be going towards high rise, they're going to start using cranes. And these cranes get built as they go. They get higher and higher and higher. Sometimes these cranes are well over 100 feet off the ground. They're huge. Well, cranes are very dangerous. They have to be, as long as they're set up right, and if they don't go overload, then they're going to be fine. So here's a typical frame setup in this photograph that you can see, and the operator is somewhere up in here, and so the tower is, usually up high, and the operator is up in there, and he's got to have good visibility. So there's going to be a lot of glass. Crane failures, as I said before, are usually due to they didn't set it up right, or they overloaded it and used too heavy a material for the counterbalances that they will have with the crane. An interesting story, a lot of times crane failures, and I'm going to include some little videos, and maybe I'll include a couple of crane failure videos. They're very frightening. When they go down, a lot of other stuff can go down. It can be a big nightmare. But here's, when you think of cranes, you think of crane failures or cranes falling over, overloaded, tipping over, things like that. Here's one that was very uncommon that I heard about, was told by some LA City fire guys. They responded to a man with a heart attack on a job site, and then they found out it was the guy all the way up at the top in the tower in the crane. And he was, gosh, I would say at least 150, 200 feet off the ground. So they had to climb up the ladder to get to him. So one paramedic went to him, and he carried with him a mobile paramedic bag that was on his backpack, but he also carried with him rappelling climbing kind of gear. And he had to get, so the guy was alive, and they had to get a helicopter to come. They dropped down a winch, they harnessed him up, and they lifted him out and up to the helicopter and then took him to the hospital. Very unique kind of rescue, but another, there are things that happen on job sites that are kind of crazy. Another thing that is very dangerous, only if it's built wrong. Scaffolding is safe if it's built right. It should be proper. It's best if it's used with framework that's made of steel tubes and couplers. Nowadays, more often than not, you'll see that a professional company, all they do is scaffolding. They'll come in and do the scaffolding. And those guys rarely make mistakes. It's on the jobs where they're trying to save money. So I had a rescue I went on where they had taken and scabbed in 2x4s to the framing of the building, and then they laid some big they made a platform on these scabbed in 2x4s that were nailed into the frame of the building. Well, they either got too many guys on it, or one of their 2x4s had a knot in it or something, but it failed and it broke, and these two guys fell about 30, 40 feet, and they landed on a lumber pile, and one of the guys was really, really messed up. So scaffolding is another danger, but also things falling from the building. So a lot of times on the outside of the scaffolding, they'll put this netting that you can see in this photograph here. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look up here, you can kind of see it against the sky. So not only do they have scaffolding for the welders and all of the others who are doing work, but they've got protection from stuff falling onto the street or falling onto people below. So scaffolding has to be of an approved type. And hey, we might have to go up there to rescue somebody, an injury, a heart attack, like on the other deal I was talking about. So we want to make sure all of this stuff is done safely. And usually a good, reputable contractor's company, they're going to have a safety project manager who watches out for these things. And if they don't have a safety guy, the project manager himself, or herself, is the person that has to make sure that all of these things are done correctly, that they have the right permits, that they're doing all of this stuff. So let's go back to, I talked about hot work, but fire dangers on the job site. Well, here's the deal. A lot of wood is usually used on these job sites, and a lot of flammable materials that once they're encased in drywall or in stucco or siding or whatever, they're not as vulnerable to fire. But in the building process, they're extremely vulnerable. So what we see is that oftentimes the fires will happen in this construction process. And as you can see here, this was in downtown LA. There was an apartment complex that was under construction. In the middle of the night, it caught fire. Probably arson in this case. And look at this photo. You can see downtown LA and the fire. I mean, it looked like an apocalypse. Some of the pictures I've seen, that like all of downtown was on fire. It was huge and did a lot of damage to the buildings nearby. So, what's the source of fires usually at a job site? Number one, as I said before, is hot work. Um, Usually it's the plumbers or the welders that are at fault. If they have their extinguisher nearby like they're supposed to and got their permit, or a hose, or even a bucket, something to put out any, where their sparks get flammable materials going, and then it's not a big deal. But once it gets going, it's almost impossible to stop. And that was the case in downtown LA. And I've been on these kind of fires. We had one here in Santa Clarita where I worked. They had one out in Lancaster, and they were huge. And once it gets going, it's almost impossible to put out. The other causes of fire on a job site, construction site: smoking, and most job sites, they'll require no smoking on site, or they might have a designated smoking area. But arson is another cause. Not as common, but it does happen. And probably in the case of the LA City fire was, well, who's going to set a job site on fire? Well, sometimes it's disgruntled neighbors, people that didn't want this building to be here. And the other usual cause is union disputes. The the fire that was out here in Santa Clarita, they knew it was related to, they had a union dispute going on. They were 90% sure that one of the construction people lit the fire. It was in the middle of the night, but they couldn't prove it. So nobody went to jail. And, of course, there are those arsons that are just crazy people. So there are those occasions. Okay, last slide here. Another issue on job sites is collapse of structures, hazardous materials, and again, the holes that we talked about where shoring is needed. So real quick, let's just talk about collapse of structure. Usually that's related to an engineering flaw or to improper building practices. Most of the time, this just does not happen, especially in today's, we've got a much better building code, fire code. We've got a lot more oversight, but in some cities, and now as a lot of cities, especially in this COVID-19 world, governments are going to be hurting economically, and things get overseen, underlooked at. There's going to be problems. I think there's going to be problems in the future with getting inspectors out to job sites and things of that nature. So they can happen. And there's a picture on the bottom right there of a collapse of a structure under construction. But one of the really frightening ones, very rare, but on some construction sites related to road building, especially, they have explosives and some serious hazardous materials. You're always going to have a little bit of hazardous materials on a job site, but usually not explosives unless it's related to road building. In Kansas City, that picture you see on top, that's all that was left of a fire engine at an explosion where they had ammonium nitrate, ANFO they call it, that they were using as a catalyst for explosives to clear this rock where they were going to bring a road through. And a fire started. It was an unmarked shed that was holding explosives. It had no NFPA diamond on it, had nothing on it that indicated it was explosives. The firefighters had heard through dispatch, security had said, hey, there's a building on fire that we think is related to explosive storage, but we're not sure. So they had heard that, but there was a car fire. They were putting out the car fire. Then they started to concentrate on this shed fire, and it blew up. And it was a huge explosion, killed 6 firefighters, injured another, and the chief and his driver were on their way in to this fire when the explosion happened. So the driver got injured, the chief did not. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And then lastly, whenever there's holes in the ground, uh, we got to be really careful of that. And every once in a while, our urban search and rescue teams might get called to a job site where somebody's fallen into a hole in the ground. These caisson holes that are talked about in this chapter, where they're attaching the foundation, they got to dig down deep to where the foundation needs to be embedded into bedrock. Um, Sometimes these holes are 100 feet deep. I mean, it's crazy. And we had a job site where somebody here in Santa Clarita fell in a hole, and the hole was not that big. And he was an inspector, if I remember correctly. He'd come to the site on the weekend to inspect uh, off hours. So he ended up like a taco down in this big hole, and it took an enormous process to get him out. He was alive in the hole, but as soon as they started pulling him out, and by the way, the firefighter who was finally able to get him out, they had to pick the littlest guy, and he went down upside down, and he was able to put this harness on him, and they were able to pull him out. But as soon as they pull him out, he was so full of internal injuries that he bled out, and he was dead by the time they got him out of the hole and onto the surface. It was a tragic story, but job sites, construction sites are very dangerous places. As firefighters, we need to be, every time we drive onto a construction site, whether it's just to inspect or because of some kind of an injury, we need to keep our safety helmets on. We need to have our ears and our eyes open wide, sensing, being aware of our surroundings and all of the hazards and dangers that are there. So thanks for your patience. I had hoped for this to be a little bit shorter, but I get carried away telling stories. So have a great time reading this chapter. This is really interesting stuff. And hang in there. I think we're going to have a Zoom soon, okay? And I'll let you all know the time and date for that.